Manufacturing jobs have been declining in America since the 1970s. And for presidential candidate Andrew Yang, getting those jobs back is a top priority. Yang's signature policy proposal is the Freedom Dividend, which would work as a type of universal basic income, giving every American adult $1,000 per month with no strings attached. And he really means every American, regardless of economic background. To pay for it, Yang proposes a tax on companies who have benefited the most from automation. The son of Taiwanese immigrants who settled in upstate New York, Yang spent his career in the private sector leading successful businesses and startups. He announced his presidential candidacy in November with a very different approach from most candidates. His universal income proposal has caught some national attention, but he's also made headlines for supporting free Medicare for all and for promising to legalize marijuana at the federal level and to pardon all nonviolent drug offenders on 420. Today, we will get to know the candidate, getting an exclusive look into the plans he has for the country if he's elected. Good evening and welcome to our first Insider 2020 Town Hall with Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang. I'm Lionel Moyes. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight, Yang will be taking questions from our live studio audience, you tuning in at home, and also our political editor, Anthony Fisher. Please keep in mind you can post questions in the comments below. We may use your full name on air, but we will get your questions answered. Before we begin tonight, though, Mr. Yang, I'd like to give you a few moments to tell us why you feel you should be the next president of the United States.
Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure to be here. Business Insider is one of the main places I actually get my information, so I was thrilled to accept this invite. I'm running for president to help solve the problems that got Donald Trump elected in 2016. And to me, the main driver of his election was that we'd automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all the swing states he needed to win. And how many of you all work in technology? Some of you definitely do. My friends in technology know full well that what we did to the manufacturing workers, we will now do to retail jobs, call center jobs, fast food jobs, and most disastrously, trucking jobs in the years to come. So we need to help America manage the greatest economic and technological transformation in our history, which is what we're in the midst of right now. It got Donald Trump elected. We have to wake people up to the fact that it's not immigrants that are causing these problems. It's an evolving economy and technology's growing ability to push more and more Americans to the sidelines. And that's why I'm proposing universal basic income of $1,000 a month, the Freedom Dividend, which would help millions of Americans make a more effective transition in this new economy. It would also make us stronger, healthier, mentally healthier, more productive, and would be an enormous catalyst for entrepreneurs around the country. It would create over 2 million new jobs just because we'd all have more money to spend. This is the trickle-up economy, from people, families, and communities up, and this is why I'm running for president.
So the unthinkable has happened. The Mueller report is out. And a great many of your Democratic competitors think impeachment is the way to go. Do you?
Well, as someone running for president, it's my job to beat Donald Trump at the ballot box. And I think the way to do that is by solving the problems that got him elected. It's Congress's job to decide whether or not he should be impeached. So I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to let Congress do theirs.
So you don't take a position whether or not Trump should be impeached?
Well, for better or for worse, I've been a little bit too busy to dig through the Mueller report. You know, I mean, it's 448 pages or something like that.
You should read us. We've done plenty of coverage on it.
I know. So I have read summaries. And while there have certainly been actions that Donald Trump have taken that I think are really objectionable and perhaps impeachable, to me, it's Congress's responsibility to do their job and make that determination.
So you just mentioned automation and immigration. Now, I think a great many people who voted for Donald Trump would be receptive to the idea that automation is getting rid of their jobs. But they also believe that immigration, both legal and illegal, is causing their jobs to either become redundant or that immigrants will work for less or do jobs Americans won't do. How would you reach the Trump voter who puts a greater emphasis on immigration harming their livelihood than automation?
Well, I've been campaigning around the country for the last number of months. And when I say it is not immigrants, it is technology, that's causing these dislocations, most every group of Americans I've spoken to agrees with that. There's no one that's like, no, I refuse to accept that it's robots. And I use real examples. I say, look, if you go to an American factory, you're not going to see wall-to-wall immigrants. You're going to see wall-to-wall robot arms and machines. And the reason why so many malls and stores are closing is that Amazon's sucking up $20 billion in commerce every year. And if you go to an Amazon fulfillment center, again, it's going to be wall-to-wall robots and machines. So I just have not had a conversation with Americans where they wouldn't accept that set of facts when you present it to them.
But have you spoken to Americans who do think that immigration's a problem, both legal and illegal?
Yeah, I have met with Americans who do feel like our immigration system is not serving their interests. I'm obviously the son, well, maybe not obviously, but I'm the son of immigrants. And so I naturally believe that immigrants are positive for our economy and our society. Like the immigrants add dynamism in many, many ways, both economically and culturally. And so when I talk to Americans who do have that sentiment, I do express to them, look, the facts indicated is not immigrants that are causing the problems that you're most concerned about. And for the most part, they've found that compelling.
One of your big proposals that we just saw a little bit earlier was legalizing marijuana in the United States, something that you vowed to do if you became president, and also pardoning any nonviolent drug offenders on 4/20, a very strategic date as well. Do you have any plans in place to help these people get into the cannabis industry? Because the industry that we're seeing grow so much right now is blocking out people who have been convicted from this same product, the same thing that has been classified as a drug in our country.
Yeah, I've seen proposals on the table to help channel the economic gains from the cannabis industry to neighborhoods that have been victimized by our drug laws over the last number of years. I'm supportive of those proposals. I mean, the main thing we can do, in my opinion, is put $1,000 a month into people's hands. And then if you come out of prison, you're like, wow, things sure have changed since I went to jail. You know, like they were giving out dividends when I went in, and now that I'm out. President Yang making it happen. So if there are ways that we can structurally channel those benefits, those economic benefits, to communities that have been hurt by the drug laws, I'd be all for it. I've seen those proposals, and I'm very supportive of them.
So you would probably have a hell of a time getting marijuana legalization through Congress. But as president, you could get marijuana descheduled off of Schedule 1 of the DEA scheduling, where it's considered it has no medicinal value and a high risk of addiction. If you were president, would you instruct your attorney general to reclassify marijuana?
Yes, I agree with you. That's the first step. It's the most straightforward, where if you just get it off the controlled substances list, then all of a sudden there is an enforcement at the federal level. I actually disagree that it's going to be difficult to get it through Congress, because the vast majority of Americans at this point support legalizing marijuana. A lot of people have friends and relatives that are using it for medicinal purposes, and it's a much safer approach than, frankly, a lot of the opiates that people are using to manage pain.
We're going to open it up now to some of our audience members' questions. Our first one is from John, who's an attorney who's worked on racial justice, workers' rights, and education initiatives at civil rights and nonprofits.
Hi, candidate Yang. Nice to meet you. I'm interested in hearing what you, as a candidate, and if elected as president, will do to address the issue of voter suppression, especially in communities of color.
Well, thank you. It's a tremendous question, and it's a real problem. I mean, we have laws on the books, and then a lot of those laws are not necessarily being enforced in equitable ways. And you have de facto voter suppression measures going on in certain states around the country. So at the federal level, we want to first enforce the laws that are on the books. That'll actually go a long way. And voting rights are under attack in many jurisdictions. What we have to do is we have to work with the states to try and alleviate those measures. Some of them, unfortunately, are at the state level and not at the federal level, but to the extent the federal government can lend resources and support the people who are fighting for voter rights, that's exactly what we should do.
Our next question is coming from Claire, who works on women's civic engagement and wants to know about your thoughts on technology regulation.
So you propose creating a Department of Technology in order to better regulate the tech industry and AI. However, considering how heavily you rely on AI and other technologies and many of your other policy proposals, how will the government separate its interests in partnering with these technology companies from your regulation of them?
Thank you. It's a great question. I sat down with the folks who are developing AI in Silicon Valley. And we have to look around in terms of the global landscape. We're competing with China in AI, and China actually has a number of structural advantages. One is that they have access to more data because they have a more lax attitude about their own privacy. And two, they have a federal government, or the Chinese government, that's putting billions of dollars into computing infrastructure and resources. And when I met with the folks in Silicon Valley, they looked at me and they said, look, we're ready to spend $1, $2, $5 billion on this, but we can't match what the Chinese are doing. So what I said to the folks in Silicon Valley was that, look, you'll have a partner in President Yang. I'm going to try and help maintain America's global competitiveness in AI by putting real resources to help support our industry leaders. But in return, you have to do something for us, which is you have to accept that we need to have some information and not oversight, but at least an open line of communication so that we're aware of the changes that AI could wreak around the country. And what concerns me is that you don't need artificial general intelligence, which is perhaps years or decades away, to get rid of hundreds of thousands of call center jobs or truck driving jobs. That's not what you think of as AI in a science fiction sort, where it's not like smart, but it's smart enough to do the work that many Americans do right now. So I'm less concerned about what you'd consider the science fiction scenario, and more concerned about the immediate economic effects. But I think that there is a balance we can strike as the federal government to be a partner to industry leaders while also making the public's concerns more prevalent in their thought process and considerations.
Our next question is from Mike, who's originally from Allentown, Pennsylvania, but has been in New York for 3 years and wants to know more about data privacy.
I actually feel funny sitting down answering these questions. I'm just going to stand up because I knew I was going to get some questions from the internet. So then part of me was like, it's like I'm going to sit, I'm going to stand, so I'll stand. That's right.
Hi, Andrew. Excited to be here to speak today. So I wanted to ask you a bit, could you elaborate a little more on your data as a property right policy, specifically what the economic value the individual is going to receive would look like?
Thanks, it's a great question. And so, like most of you, when I interact with these internet companies, there's some disclaimer and I just hit agree so I can use their service. It's like no one reads that stuff. It's boilerplate. But the fact is that our data actually has significant commercial value. And this is particularly true in certain industries like healthcare, where your data can get sold and resold for literally hundreds of dollars, and you never know about it. So to me, it does not seem fair that companies are benefiting to the tune of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of dollars per year on our data, and we barely know about it. Sometimes they actually make mistakes where our data gets actually accessed by some bad actor, and then most of the time we don't even know about it, or if we do know about it, we get some email saying, hey, you might want to change your passwords because we might have made a mistake there. So there's a little bit of a Wild West going on. And a lot of Americans will choose convenience first and foremost, but if we do choose convenience, then we deserve at least some sliver of the economic value that our data is creating. And so the goal is to create like a set of preferences that we can express, and then if we say, look, you can have my data, but if you commercialize that data to the tune of thousands of dollars a year, you at least need to send me a little bit of that money. And that's going to be one of my goals as president, is to make our data our own, and if we choose to share it, then at least we should get some share of the value.
So you have an incredibly robust set of policies on your website, much more than your Democratic competitors. One of them that jumped out at me, speaking of criminal justice reform, is you want to equip all police officers in the United States with body cameras. Now there's 18,000, give or take, law enforcement agencies at the federal, state, and local level. There are many police unions. There's a lot of autonomy at the local level.
Yes.
How would you execute that? How would you get every police officer in the U.S. wearing a body camera?
Well, you're right that there are many, many local agencies, and it's not necessarily the case that even as president, I could say every police officer in every agency is going to have a body camera. But what you can do at the federal level is you can say it is funded fully. And we're not talking about that mammoth an amount of money. We're talking about maybe several $1 billion would be enough to buy a camera for every police officer in the country. And then if you're a police department, you're literally like, well, the feds have funded this. And so we don't like the idea of cameras so much that we're going to turn down free cameras for our officers. That's going to be a very hard argument for municipal departments to make. And then if you're a citizen of that town, you're like, wait a minute, they're like literally free cameras that you guys are turning down? Like, what are you guys doing over there? So you could get significant adoption around the country if you just foot the bill. And from a public standpoint, I think we'd all accept what's a relatively trivial cost in the context of our budget to know that there's a new standard being offered for police officers around the country, which is that we expect their interactions with us to be recorded. And then if that's the new norm, then any interaction that's not recorded, then we'd look at it and say, well, what happened there? And then it becomes more and more of a standard for police officers to adopt over time.
So pivoting to the opioid crisis, you've called for the decriminalization of opioids. Some of your Democratic rivals want to go the opposite direction. They think that a crisis needs to be met with greater criminal sanctions. Can you explain to our audience why you think your position on this is right and your rivals are wrong?
So this is going to sound very politician-y, but I was in Iowa with this high school student who told me a story about how his classmates have fentanyl patches on their arms because they're already addicted to opiates. And many of them would not seek treatment because they know it's against the law to be using these drugs. And he said, what can we do? And this really hit home to me because I was like, what can we do? This guy's literally like walking around his high school and his like friends are addicted to opiates. Now, I feel very, very strongly about this because the government was delinquent in allowing the opiate crisis to get started in the first place. The feds turned a blind eye when Purdue Pharma started dispensing OxyContin prescriptions all over the country, saying it's this non-addictive wonder drug, when instead it was terribly addictive. And eventually, Purdue Pharma paid a fine of $635 million, which sounds like a ton, until you realize they made $30 billion on OxyContin. They got a 2% fine, and now the Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, are among the 20 richest families in the country. Think about that, that's blood money, because now we have 8 Americans dying of drug overdoses every hour in this country. So if you're a fair society and you look around and say, wait a minute, there's a plague killing thousands of Americans every year that we helped cause, or at least did not do enough to protect our people from, then the least you can do is go to those people and say, look, if you're struggling with addiction, our first priority is to get you treatment and not bring you to a prison cell. And that opens up the avenue for more of our citizens to say, look, I need help. And then we can get resources into their hands. When other countries have decriminalized these drugs, they've seen a drop in both overdose rates and usage rates. And this is a public health crisis of the highest order. We have to be pulling out all the stops. Now, I'm not for decriminalizing drug dealing or selling these drugs. It's just if we find you with a supply that's less than a week, and it's clear that you're using it for personal uses, then it should not be a criminal act that sends you to prison. We should be sending you right to a counselor and right to treatment.
So when there's a crisis, as you've described it as, there's a bipartisan push. It's with both parties to do something, anything. And a lot of times the easiest thing to do is to increase the criminal sanctions. You seem to have a well thought out position on this. How would you push back against people, especially people in your own party, who feel like you got to do something?
Oh, we do have to do something. I mean, we have to get resources into people's hands. And treatment for opiates, it's really difficult. It's not a dollar problem. It's more of a human problem. And I'm sure there are people in this room that have had friends and family struggle with opiate addiction, that even if you have resources, treatment can not take even after several tries. So we have to give people the resources and make it so that at least people have a fighting chance. And if my fellow candidates think a fighting chance means stricter criminal laws, then I would respectfully disagree, because most people who are struggling with addiction are not going to be deterred by the fact that maybe they'll face a stiffer sentence if they get caught with the drugs.
We have a question from the audience now. This person submitted, will green card holders and non-citizens who are contributing to the U.S. economy be eligible for the Freedom Dividend?
So I have many friends who are in that position, and the Freedom Dividend would initially be available only to citizens. But I'm for a speedy path to citizenship for legal residents and green card holders. And in a way, it's a bigger incentive to become a citizen. That if you become a citizen, then you'll become eligible. And I have many friends who have green cards who've been stuck in this limbo for months and even years because we have this bureaucracy that's backlogged. So the hope would be that we could clear up that backlog as fast as possible. And if green card holders want to become citizens, then we help them do so, and then they would be eligible for the dividend.
All right, Mr. Yang, we're going to open it back up to our audience that is in here with us right now. So many people have questions about the Freedom Dividend. We want to bring up Joshua now, who's a political science student at NYU, who's been really passionate about politics since middle school. So I'm sure you have a lot that you'd like to know.
Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to thank you for pushing the issues of automation and universal basic income toward the front and center of the primary deliberations, because it's an issue I've felt very strongly about for a long time. But one question that I do have is, would you be in favor of either a higher universal basic income in areas with higher cost of living, or mandating a minimum wage that must make ends meet when coupled with your monthly UBI? Because here in New York, not even in the lowest income areas of the city would the UBI plus 40 hours a week at the minimum wage make ends meet.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm glad that you've been passionate about universal basic income and automation for a while now. So it's very difficult administratively to have a universal basic income vary by geography, because the fact is people move around, and the last thing you want is a situation where people are like saying, oh, I live in New York, and then really they're like heading off to other parts of the country that are lower cost, which is something that a lot of Americans would do, honestly, if you were to scale it depending upon the cost of living. So $1,000 a month, free and clear for everyone, is much easier to administer. And it's also the case that people who live in a very expensive place like New York City, where we are right now, we make a decision to live here largely because we think we can access better opportunities. And so it doesn't seem fair to say, not only are you going to live someplace where you can access better opportunities, but we're also going to give you more money to account for the fact it's expensive. Now, to the second part of your question, it is messed up when Americans are working full-time and can't make ends meet. And so $1,000 a month does not solve the problem entirely in a place like Manhattan, but $1,000 a month does give us all more dynamism and flexibility, and it makes it harder for workers to be pushed around by their employers. So if there is an employer that's sticking it to you and saying, look, you're going to do this job for too little to live on, if you have $1,000 a month, it's easier for you to say, you know what, I don't necessarily need this job. I'm going to find another job that suits my needs a little bit better.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
And we have another question about the Freedom Dividend. No surprise. This is from Ping, who is a software engineer and a first-time primary voter as well.
Hi, Andrew. My question is, why do you think the Freedom Dividend is a better solution than the free college or baby bonds?
Hey, Ping. How's it going? Hopefully your first vote will be coming for this guy. Oh, it's already no? That's great. I can say whatever I want. Next question. No, I'm kidding. Free college is something that I'm for the spirit of, because people shouldn't be going to college and having these crazy debt loads that young people have today. We're up to $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, and it's causing many of our young people to make very, very different choices. I had student loan debt myself for a long time in my 20s. That said, about 33% of Americans graduate from college. So if we say, hey, college is now free, that's something that's going to help the top third of the population. And that level of 33% has been more or less stable for a long time. It's not like it's going to go from 33% to 65%. It's not happening. And we know that in part because the 6-year completion rate from college right now is only 59%. That is 41% of people who start are dropping out without having graduated within 6 years. So right now we have a lot of people that are heading to college that it's not a great fit for. And making it free is helpful, but it's helpful only for that population that's going to head there. So what we have to do, in my opinion, is we have to invest a lot in vocational and apprenticeship and technical education, which would open up opportunities for more Americans around the country. Only 6% of American high school students are in a technical track right now. In Germany, that's 59%. Think about that for a second. 6%, 59%. What should our percentage be? Probably a lot higher than 6. Maybe you could imagine it being 26, and that would be more appropriate. So that would be a more varied investment that would help more Americans than just free college. And then you had a second suggestion.
Baby bonds.
Baby bonds. So my big complaint about baby bonds is who has 18 years to wait? You know what I mean? I mean, the robot trucks are coming in 5 to 10 years. We can look up and be like, well, at least the baby bonds are on their way. I mean, that's not going to help the truckers. It's not going to help the call center workers. If you had retroactive baby bonds, tell you what, retroactive baby bonds that make it so that everyone at age 18 or over gets $1,000 a month, then I'm on board. Thanks, Ping.
I do have a follow-up question about the Freedom Dividend. How do you envision that working with government assistance programs that are in place now? Would it be in conjunction or would it be a replacement for that?
So the Freedom Dividend would be universal. Everyone gets it, but it's opt-in. And if you opt in, then you're then foregoing benefits from certain existing programs. So the goal is to make no one's life worse. The last thing I would ever do is take benefits away from an American or a family of Americans that need it to meet their monthly needs. I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, we're going to get rid of it all and turn it into cash. What we do is we create the dividend, and then people can choose which they'd prefer. And over time, we'd see that the dividend ends up hopefully providing a positive set of incentives so that if people flourish, then they still keep the dividend, whereas some of our current programs, unfortunately, do have a disincentive where if you do better, then you get less over time.
Another question from the audience now. This question says, polls show that environmental issues are top of mind for young people. What do you think is the best and fastest way to address climate change and the exponential destruction of our planet?
So that was a question from the internet or someone here?
This is from someone here who anonymously submitted it.
Who asked
for
it?
For me to ask it.
Who's into climate change? No, I'm saying that's like a bad thing. I mean, climate change, obviously, if you're into it and it's you. All right, fantastic. I'm a science guy, but you don't need to be a scientist to know that the last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. I mean, climate change is becoming a greater and greater threat. Now, to me, financial insecurity and addressing climate change are actually tied together. Because if you're living in a country where 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, they're not sure whether they're going to be able to pay their bills, and 57% can't afford an unexpected $500 bill, then if you go to those Americans and say, hey, we really need to focus on climate change, a lot of them will say, I cannot pay my bills. The penguins will have to wait in line. And that seems obnoxious, but that's just the way a lot of people are going to react because we have this mindset of scarcity that has swept our country. It's one reason why we're starting to see ourselves so polarized. So if we have a dividend in place for Americans and everyone's getting $1,000 a month, then the economic boot comes off of people's throats. And then if you go to them and say, we need to address climate change, it's a major threat, then more of them will say, yeah, we do. Like, I have kids and I want to leave this planet in better shape. So climate change is threat 1A to our way of life. But the fastest way to address it is by addressing this pervasive financial insecurity, which we have much more control over than we do many other things. And then we can try and address climate change as fast as possible. The tough reality, though, is that the United States of America only accounts for about 15% of global emissions. And a lot of the time we act like it's 100%. So I'm for rejoining the Paris Accords. I'm for trying to lead the world in the right direction. I'm for a carbon fee and dividend. But even if we were to go very aggressively towards renewable sources of energy, we're probably looking at the effects of climate change over the coming years in any case. And the best we can do is slow it down incrementally. So we need to start trying to mitigate the worst effects, investing in our infrastructure. But I'm on board with the fact that climate change is an existential threat to our way of life.
And where are you at on the Green New Deal? Support?
So I'm going to sit and answer because it seems weird just to be like, what do I think? Yeah. So I'm for the spirit of the Green New Deal in that anything that moves us towards more renewable sources of energy, we should do. And so I applauded the legislators who got behind that, and I said that the vision is exactly the kind of vision we need.
We have another question from someone here in person in the audience. We're going to bring up Norman now, who was born and raised in New York and studied urban design at Queens College with a question on infrastructure.
So, hi, Andrew.
Hey, Norman.
My question is, infrastructure is an important but costly investment that needs to be made. How will the money to fix American infrastructure be raised, and how will the plan differ from previous promises to fix our aging highways, transit, and critical systems?
This is one thing I really thought Donald Trump would get right. You know, he gets elected and you're like, well, at least he's going to build a bunch of stuff and then put his name on it. And I would accept driving over Trump Bridge if there was a new bridge. I'd be like, well, I'll take it for a new bridge. But he couldn't even get that right. That, unfortunately, we're still going to have to do it ourselves after we get that guy out of office in 2020. And so the plan is to go to the American people. The fact is, right now, infrastructure investment is wildly popular. Everyone knows that we're living on investments from decades past, that our highways and bridges are crumbling and becoming dangerous. And the wonderful thing about infrastructure investment is that it actually pays off, where if you invest a certain amount of money into infrastructure, you know that over time you'll actually get that money back. So this is going to be something that I believe that we're going to have bipartisan support for when I'm president, and this is a major lost opportunity from the current administration. Again, this was something I thought that they would do a much better job of.
Well, thank you everyone for submitting your questions, and you can continue doing that. Please leave them in the comments below, and we're going to get to them in just a few moments. One thing that we've heard so much about is the Freedom Dividend tonight, and Mr. Yang has already been testing this out on a smaller scale with a family in New Hampshire. Our team got a moment to go see that family and see the difference that it's making in their life. Take a look.
We are the Fasseys, and we live in Goffstown, New Hampshire. My name is Charles Fassey, and this is my wife, Jody Fassey.
My name is Chanel Fassey, and I am a sophomore at St. Anselm College in Goffstown, New Hampshire.
I am a service technician for a chemical company.
And I clean homes for a living.
I was actually forced to resign from my position at my last company.
Well, it was stressful because Janelle, we had to set up her dorm. She was starting her first year of college. So he's got no income coming in. We just sent her first college payment in. So it was very stressful. So I had the house on the market. My husband had a sports car we didn't need, so that was sold.
Currently, our income between the both of us is about $70,000 between my salary and her cleaning business. To maintain a house and college tuition, based on our income, I think we're probably just getting by.
I found out about the UBI first when I was at an event with the New Hampshire Young Democrats. They were holding an event with Andrew Yang. I thought I would sign my family up for the UBI because my dad was really struggling with when he lost his job.
When the phone rang and I saw Andrew Yang on the caller ID, I had no idea that's what he was calling for.
So the goal is to have you start receiving the Freedom Dividend the first thing in January, $1,000 a month through the entire calendar year of 2019.
Really? That's incredible. He just took so much stress off of my shoulders. Like, I can sleep better. We have this extra money that I can, take care of our household with, and I thought it was such a blessing. I was so happy and grateful. My husband actually started to cry. He didn't think we were deserving enough.
We're a middle-class white family. We're not really struggling to the point that we're going to be homeless tomorrow. And, I know that it's not that we're not deserving, but I just felt like we weren't the most deserving.
Thanks to him, he helped us stay in the home, keep Janelle in school. And Chucky also wants to give back to our community. We're actually going to be doing an essay contest, and we're going to give one of the checks, distribute it to like a scholars fund for somebody else in town.
I believe the universal basic income I think it would be hopefully a help to start the income inequality in this country, but it's definitely not an end point.
All right, hopefully that gave you a little bit of a closer and more personal idea of the Freedom Dividend. Facebook, if you have not submitted your questions, you are running out of time, so I'm giving you another opportunity. Mr. Yang, we're going to actually open it up to more questions from people online. Our first one is from Andrew, who asks, many of your policies are with a view to the future. How do you plan to win over the older voting demographic?
Well, I've been meeting with Americans around the country, and it doesn't matter if you're young or old, where you're experiencing the fact that our economy has become increasingly difficult for more and more families. And so, to me, it's independent of age, really the punitive nature of our economy. I meet middle-aged Americans around the country who are incredibly fed up, and they see that our government has become unresponsive and out of touch. I don't know what the average age is of people who are supporting my campaign. It does seem like I'm very popular among young people. I'm at like 9% among 18 to 29. But when I go to a rally that we have, it's actually a very, very diverse group of Americans, certainly by age and by gender and by every other demographic or characteristic.
And John is asking, why did you suggest that there should be a gradual rollout or study as it pertains to universal basic income?
Well, if you look at what happened in the 60s and 70s, the American government, this is going to sound far out or too good to be true, but the American government just started giving money out to various people in various communities to start measuring effects. And when you're talking about a change this massive throughout the economy, then it makes sense just to get some more data and information. I'm a firm believer in universal basic income, where if I had a choice between either just like pull the lever and start giving the money out to everyone in the country as soon as possible, that's the path that I would choose. But when you're dealing with getting something through the legislative process, people are going to rightfully expect to have a certain amount of information that they can rely upon before making a change nationwide.
So some people who might be skeptical of UBI might say, why stop at 1,000? Why not 2,000? Why not 3,000? If the goal is to help people, if it's to cut down on income inequality, why is only 1,000 your number?
Well, I think $1,000 is the perfect starting point because it pushes every American adult up to right below the poverty level. So the poverty level is $12,770 a year per individual. And so if you were a household of 2 adults, you'd be getting $24,000 a year. That's a really big difference maker, but that's also not going to be massively disruptive to our existing labor markets because it's not like any American's going to quit their job on $12,000 a year. I mean, think about it. Anyone here going to quit their job? If you're going to quit your job on $12,000 a year, you must really be itching to quit your job. You know, like that job must be pretty terrible. You'd be like, oh, I can't wait to get out. So you're not going to disrupt the existing economy. It's going to be this incredible boost for many households and many families, but it's not going to be changing everything all at once.
Heidi is asking, how do you propose addressing intellectual property protection concerns among U.S. companies and China? And why would you keep or remove the current tariffs that have been imposed by Trump if China does not change its policies?
So if you look at the U.S.-China relationship, I think intellectual property is certainly one of the most important considerations where U.S. companies are losing the tunes of billions of dollars because of China's companies essentially just taking intellectual property, software in particular. So the question is, how can we change that? And tariffs, to me, are a really imperfect tool. Again, I was just in Iowa. I hate to say that, but I was just in Iowa, and the farmers and businesses there are furious because they voted for Donald Trump by almost 10% in Iowa, and then the farmers have seen their business relationships with various other countries just wither and die because of the tariffs. And a farmer actually said to me just last week in Iowa, he said, I spent 6 years building up a relationship with a particular company in China. Now that relationship's gone, and I have no idea if I'm ever going to get it back. And he voted for Trump, and he was very, very angry. So to me, as someone who's run a business myself, I would also be furious if the prices got changed on me after I spent months or years trying to build a relationship or make investments. And so if we are going to use tariffs, we'd want to use them in a way that people would have a lot of visibility. You wouldn't change the prices in the near term. You would change them literally years down the road and try and use that as a prod to get China to the bargaining table. But I'm convinced that there are better ways to address our concerns with China than tariffs that end up just punishing businesses and workers on both sides of the dispute.
Our jury is clarifying something that we discussed a little bit earlier. His question is, some people have a concern that your Freedom Dividend proposal might create inflation in rent prices. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there are 3 sources of inflation that are driving Americans nuts. And those 3 are housing, education, and healthcare. Those are the big 3. If you look at our consumer prices, they've essentially stayed stable for a while on things like clothing or media or electronics or food for the most part. And so housing is the big one. Now, the great thing is if everyone has $1,000 a month, that goes with you wherever you go. And so right now, a lot of people are somewhat stuck in place because they don't want to move too far away from where they work. But if you have $1,000 that's portable, it makes you much more mobile. And it also means that if 4 of you got together and said, hey, among the 4 of us, we have $4,000 a month. Like, that's enough to actually not just be renters, but maybe we could throw down on a property together. Maybe we could pick up a fixer-upper. So there are things that the dividend will do that will actually help with the inequities in the rental market. The tough part about the fact that certain landlords are sticking it to tenants is that a lot of that stuff is local. And the zoning restrictions in many communities are that you can't build affordable housing, and many developers have a much higher incentive to develop fancy apartments rather than apartments that people there can afford. So to the extent the federal government can change those incentives, I would be all for that. But a lot of that's going to come down to the local level with cities and communities trying to make it easier for people to build affordable housing.
I have a question for you about our military. What is your stance on trans men and women serving in the armed forces? Because this has been something that has been very controversial recently in America.
Well, to me, anyone who wants to serve in the military, we should be embracing that and applauding that. And so if there's a trans citizen who wants to serve our country in that capacity, that's something that I'd personally be very supportive of. I would consult with the generals who are closest to the front lines, who will let us know whether that's a serious problem, but to me, it's something that we should be supporting.
And we're going to open it back up to our audience here. We have Lee, who works in investor relations for life sciences companies, with the next question.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for taking the question. In your book, you talk about a lot of scenarios, including the troubling one about the intersection of underemployment, unemployment, and guns. So my question is, do you have any plans, or what plans would you support that would mandate training, registration, or background checks on every sale or transfer? And what's your position on federal gun buybacks?
Thanks for the question, Lee. So there are about 300 million firearms in this country right now, almost one for every man, woman, and child. We're the most heavily armed society in the history of the world. And so I'm for treating firearm sales much like the way we treat vehicle sales, where you get tested and licensed for buying a car or truck because they can kill people. Firearms can kill people too, and we should be testing and licensing to the extent possible. So I'm for common sense gun safety legislation, and I'm very much for a federal gun buyback. I mean, under President Yang, we'd be like, hey, anyone who wants to give us your gun, like, we've got the money for you, because anything we can do to decrease the supply would be great. I would also be for investing in smart gun technology and making those upgrades complementary to gun owners, so you could have your own fancy gun that only you can fire, and that makes us all safer, because then if that gun gets into someone's hands or a kid's hands, they can't use it. This, to me, is one of the issues that we're going to be, unfortunately, facing. I mean, we saw the shootings just this past weekend, that we need to do everything we can in our power as a society to make it harder for people who would wish harm upon others to get dangerous firearms and decrease the supply over time. Unfortunately, there's no quick fix. This is going to be a generational problem. One other thing I would invest in that I think everyone will be able to get behind that's very related is a mental health initiative. Because right now we have a giant mental health crisis in this country, and in many cases we might have been able to catch some of the perpetrators of these crimes if we had enough resources in place to help them. My brother's a clinical psychologist, and I know we can do much, much more to help people who are struggling.
So obviously there's going to be a lot of pushback to any gun regulations that are proposed. The Republican Party is pretty much a non-starter. How would you get these through Congress?
So this is something where, again, I think Congress and the people are actually misaligned, because the vast majority of Americans support common sense gun legislation. We do have to compromise with the legislators who are looking out for their citizens who feel very, very strongly about the Second Amendment rights. But there is zone for agreement. I'm convinced of it because I've talked to people who are very passionate about gun ownership, but even they recognize that there is something that needs to be done to help make Americans feel like this supply of deadly weapons is under control.
Our next question comes from David, who is a freelance writer who has a question about the Federal Reserve.
Hello, Mr. Yang. Thank you.
Hi, David.
Hi. Serious questions have been raised about the impartiality of many decisions the Federal Reserve's made over several administrations. As such, there have been repeated bipartisan calls for increased transparency through repeal of existing restrictions on the ability of the Comptroller General to comprehensively audit the Fed. Would you support such a bill? And were it to reach your desk as president, would you sign it?
You can put me in the school of thought that the Federal Reserve should be free of the government and depoliticized to the extent possible. And having like this cudgel where it's like, hey, do things that I like, or else we're going to do things that you don't like, strikes me as the wrong approach. There has to be some sort of independence from political considerations, or you would legitimately have presidents just being like, hey, my numbers are down. You know what we need? We need you to lower interest rates so that the economy looks better for my reelection. That's a very dark place to be. So I would be for maintaining Fed independence to the extent possible.
We're going to bring up Evelyn now, who is originally from Peru and became a U.S. citizen 10 years ago and works currently at an immigration law firm.
Hello, Andrew. My question is, what are your views on the rise of nationalism and populism as a threat to democracy in Europe and Latin America?
Well, congratulations on being a citizen. I know it's been a long time, but I still feel like it's awesome when great people become Americans. I mean, the rise of nationalism and populism, I mean, it's happening here in the US, it's happening around the world, and there are a lot of forces that are coming together to accelerate it. So one is certainly climate change. If you have lower crop yields and people moving for better opportunities, then that can cause dislocation and increased populist pressures. A lot of it is, frankly, immigration in different environments, certainly in parts of Europe where people have been migrating, and then formerly very open and generous societies have become more closed. So the US is also part of this. Like, we can see our own society being buffeted by some of the same forces. And this is one of the major institutional crises of this time. Now, for better or for worse, many of these societies are democracies, and we need to listen to our people. And so the fact that Brexit happened, as one example, I mean, that was a shock to many. But you have to pay heed. If you're a democracy and the majority of your citizens come out in a certain direction, instead of just questioning it as irrational, you have to say, well, how the heck did that happen? So these are some of the big challenges. I don't have any quick or easy answers. But I will say, unfortunately, that climate change is a big part of it. And it's one reason why we have to invest massive resources to try and mitigate the worst effects of climate change in particular. I think that we're going to need some new approaches, certainly, to the migrant crises that are happening around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Wendy, who's a retired public safety worker who was born and raised in California but moved to New York 2 months ago. Welcome to the city.
No way, you're a new New Yorker?
I'm
How's
a
it
new
going
New
for
Yorker, yes, indeed. And enjoying it, too. I'm glad to be here. Andrew, do you think it's possible to regain Americans' trust in journalism?
I think it's not only possible, I think it's vital. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is that over 1,200 local newspapers have gone out of business over the last number of years, because those local newspapers used to rely upon classified ads for their revenue, and then all those classified ads went to Craigslist online, and then they never got replaced, and so all these newspapers went out of business. So studies have shown that if you don't have a newspaper in your community, then voters tend to become more polarized, which makes sense, because if you're not getting any information about what's going on in your town, then you just tend to vote along party lines. So if you believe in an informed democracy, then you have to believe in journalism. So I have several pro-journalism plans as president. Number one, I would put together a journalism fund to help local papers transition, because a lot of these communities could support a local newspaper as a nonprofit or a model that's not meant to make people a lot of money, but the community would embrace just having that paper there. And you can use town libraries as a hub, because many town libraries already have bulletin boards that the communities go to see what's going on. So that's number one. Number two is in a new American Journalism Fellows program, where we just pay to have a journalist in every congressional district with the same thinking, which is, look, if people are going to elect a congressperson in a community, then you need some kind of journalism there so that people know what they're voting for. So I would fund it from the federal government, just say, look, this is just essentially funding for a journalist in your community, free and clear of the local papers that are already there. Because I've been now to communities around the country, and as a politician, I have to say, you feel like a jerk. Because you go to Iowa or New Hampshire and you say, hey, talk about me, spread the word about me to the people in your state. And then meanwhile, that reporter is like living on a salary that's going down and down and down. They're worried about losing their job. And then you feel like, wow, I'm asking you to help me do my job. And like, who's going to help you do yours? So as a society, we have to not only restore trust in journalism, we have to see it as a vital public function if we're going to believe in democracy. And so to me, journalism is something that I would not just try and restore trust in, I would invest in, and I would love to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner as president, because then it would actually be fun again. Unlike Donald Trump, who's like villainizing these people, it's like, let's have a good time. I mean, like, that's what that night seems to be for.
So you mentioned that you want to have a fake news ombudsman, and you just mentioned Donald Trump.
Yeah.
If Donald Trump had access to a fake news ombudsman, which we've discussed before, that would be under the rubric of the FCC, as a journalist, but more importantly, as a consumer of information, I would worry about somebody like Donald Trump or any actor who thinks of information being shared that is critical of them or is not flattering to them being deemed as fake news. That seems like a pretty dangerous cudgel for somebody to have.
Well, if you look around at what other countries have done, you look at a country like the UK, and they have the BBC, and they have an ombudsman there, where the ombudsman's like looking out for various published news stories and says, look, if this has just been fabricated or is false, then you have to, at a minimum, publish a retraction. Mm-hmm. And this is something that other countries have done. It's helped make people feel better about their reporting. And if other countries can do it, I don't see why we shouldn't have the same goal, particularly in an era where Russia is literally just messing with our information and laughing about it, and then creating bot armies on Facebook that are just turning us against each other. And we're all looking around like we're not sure we can trust journalists, to your earlier question, Wendy. So if this is the set of problems we're dealing with now, then we have to have some kind of mechanism in place, particularly because not so long from now, there are going to be deep fakes where you can just have fake videos of me and Anthony having a conversation about whatever you want. And so we need to have some kind of oversight before we lose complete trust in our media.
I don't disagree with you that disinformation is a huge problem and that there are bad actors imposing that on us right now. What worries me is that the government would have the authority to deem what is fake and what is real. And that line can be very, very gray, especially, BuzzFeed News had their report on the dossier a few months ago that turned out to be kind of problematic. With that, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for a president to authorize the FCC to go after a publication for publishing something that they believe to be true, that they have robust sourcing on, but turns out not to be.
Well, sir, if you have robust sourcing and it turns out not to be true, I mean, like that's probably something that you just look and say, well, that was an honest mistake. But you have to sort of choose which problems you're more comfortable with. And to me, we're past an era where the government could meaningfully suppress or censor all conversation about ideas it doesn't like. Because, I mean, we have the internet, we have literally thousands of news sources. This is not an era where there are 3 TV networks and you can go and say, don't talk about this. Like information is clearly going to get out there. So to me, I'm more comfortable with the fact that the government can have some kind of helpful role to play, as it does in the UK and other societies, rather than just say, well, there's nothing we can do, and just let frankly, like our trust in media continue to decline over time. I know you don't love this, Anthony, because we talked about it before.
We do. And for good reason, because the deep fakes, disinformation, these are serious problems. But it almost sounds like you're saying, don't worry about the government abusing it because the position itself wouldn't be effective enough to be a problem because information will just get out there.
Well, if it's effective, it means that really bad actors will actually feel like, okay, if I misinform the American people in a way that's destructive or sinister, then maybe someone will come after me, find me, punish me in some way, and then the landscape gets cleared up. Because one of the great things about decent enforcement is you're not expected to enforce every problem. You just enforce like a couple problems, and then every good actor will be like, oh, snap, that's actually something that's going to be bad for my organization. And again, we've seen this in other societies where it's not like the ombudsman in the UK goes around like policing everything, but just knowing the ombudsman's there helps clarify things for people.
We're going to open it up now to our final few questions from our Facebook audience. So again, thank you so much for submitting them. Mr. Yang, David is asking, what is your view on Planned Parenthood?
So when I think Planned Parenthood, I think women's reproductive rights. And certainly if there's an organization that's helping women navigate childbearing, I think that's very, very positive. In terms of women's reproductive rights, I'm on the record saying that as a man running for president, I feel like it should be up to women what women want to do in that arena. And I have a feeling we know where women will come out. I'm also on the record saying if men became pregnant, we'd have very different standards in this society. You know, if you can imagine a society where men became pregnant, like there'd be a very, very different conversation about reproductive rights. So I'm a fan of Planned Parenthood because it seems to get resources into the hands of women at a very crucial point. And it's something that, to me, we should be applauding and endorsing.
And Mike is asking, can you explain what the Freedom Fund would primarily invest in? Would it be domestic or global?
When you say Freedom Fund, do you mean?
I am asking Mike's question, so I cannot clarify for you at this moment.
I think Mike might have his terminology a little off, because the Freedom Dividend is one of your policies. Is there something with the word fund in it?
The first thing I thought of was Freedom Dividend.
Yeah.
And Freedom Dividend is a universal basic income of $1,000 per month for every American citizen. So the focus would very much be domestic.
Okay. What a nice way to answer that question. We do have another question that follows up similarly to this. Joe is asking, if we're giving everyone $1,000, can we address reparations for descendants of slaves?
So I 100% agree that we owe a great, great debt to descendants of slaves. And I read Ta-Nehisi Coates, and his writing on this is very, very compelling. Now, happily, the Freedom Dividend would be a bigger boost for communities that have lower access to education and resources, which right now, unfortunately, does include African-American communities. I think it's a great first step towards helping strengthen our families and communities across the board. And then we should look independently at the question of reparations. There's a bill in Congress right now that is meant to explore what that might look like. And that's the sort of thing we should be doing. I'm supportive of that bill. And I certainly wouldn't put my judgment ahead of the people that are going to be studying it directly.
Real quick, reparations has become a big issue among 2020 candidates. Another one that's popped up very recently, surprisingly, is whether or not incarcerated people should have the right to vote. Do you have a position on that?
You know, it's a great question. I mean, I think that committing a crime should not mean you're a non-citizen and cannot vote. So the threshold I've come up with is that if you have deprived someone else of their right to vote, then you should not have the right to vote, like as someone who's incarcerated. So as long as it's fallen short of that, then people who are in jail should have the right to vote, because presumably they're going to come out of jail and rejoin society. And studies have shown that if you vote and you're a formerly incarcerated citizen, you're actually less likely to commit a crime and go back to jail. So if that's the case, we should be applauding anyone who votes, because it means that they feel like they're part of society and will be less likely to go back to jail when they're out.
So just to be clear, you're basically saying just short of murder, anyone who's incarcerated should have the right to vote?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Cindy is asking, and this has been something that's come up with some of your opponents, will student loans be forgiven?
So I referred to it a little bit earlier about the fact that we have this immoral mountain of $1.5 trillion in school loans. That's up from less than $100 billion in 1999. Think about that. 20 years, and it went from less than $100 billion to $1.5 trillion. $38K per graduate. And the darkest thing is that if you graduate from college today, there's a 44% chance that you're going to be underemployed and do a job that doesn't require a college degree. So you get this massive debt load, and you graduate into a job market that isn't necessarily rewarding you on that level. So given that context, if you have a choice between hundreds of thousands of young people living in their families' basements, paying off loans, or moving themselves forward, hopefully buying a home, starting a family, starting a business, we should choose the latter. So I am for the forgiveness of the vast majority of the school loans that are out there. I would call it a stimulus of the people, because we know that by forgiving the student loan debt, a lot of that money is just going to get spent directly in our economy in ways that move us forward. It's going to be a much more effective way to get money into the economy than many other things we could do.
So sticking with education, something that's become pretty controversial among Democrats is whether or not to support school choice, whether or not people who are in a specific zip code where the school is underperforming and they have access to vouchers or some other mechanism that allows them to attend a different school that is a better fit for their family. Where do you stand on that?
So there are excellent charter schools and there are not so excellent charter schools. There are excellent public schools and not so excellent public schools. So to me, it's not so much the type of school, it's whether or not the school is good or bad. So to the extent that some districts want choice in terms of the types of schools they have in their communities, I am for that. So generally speaking, I'm for communities having more choices about the schools that their kids attend. As a parent myself, I know I would be very, very frustrated if I did not have any recourse, and that, like, if let's say my public school was not a good one and my kid was going there, and that there was some person who wanted a charter school there and they were prohibited from doing so, I would find that very, very problematic.
Our final question from Facebook tonight is coming from Joseph, and very timely. Joseph is asking, considering the news that we've seen today, what is your position surrounding the political atmosphere of Venezuela?
Yeah, so Venezuela is a humanitarian crisis that's now unfortunately degenerating into a failed state, perhaps. And my overall position on America's intervention in foreign affairs is that we should not be making other countries' choices for them, and we should not be intervening militarily unless it's in our vital national interest. So to the extent that we can help make things easier for the Venezuelan people who are going through really this like an incredible economic turmoil, we should do so. Anything short of force. Hopefully the Venezuelan people will make it clear that Maduro is not the leader that they want, and that we'll be able to support the new leader as he takes power. That's the goal, but we should not be intervening militarily. We've done that enough over the last number of years to see that that has many unintended consequences.
So you called Venezuela on the verge of a failed state. If there were to be an extended civil war, or if it really does truly devolve that way, would you support a robust acceptance of Venezuelan refugees into the United States?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we do have to invest in various countries, not just Venezuela, but some of the other countries that are now sending significant numbers of migrants our way. I mean, the goal has to be to keep Venezuela from becoming a failed state, because this does become something that that America is going to be facing directly, given that Venezuela's contiguous to us in terms of land, and that we're already seeing citizens from other countries migrate up through Mexico to our border. So this arguably is something that we're going to have to try and invest in directly. Hopefully what's going to happen, and this is my hope, is that it becomes clear that the Venezuelan people have decided on a particular set of leaders that we like more than the current leaders, and that they'll say, hey, come on in and help us rebuild. And that would be something that I would embrace as president.
I do have to follow up and clarify on that, though, because that would be in a perfect scenario if things do continue to work out. So if they don't, are you or are you not in favor of allowing those migrants to enter our country?
You know, to me, it's not something that we should be entertaining, because this is like after a couple of very bad things happen. I mean, if you look around the hemisphere, we're already having many, many people try and migrate to the U.S., and I'm the son of immigrants myself. I'm very instinctively pro-immigrant, but there has to be some way that we essentially manage the immigration process, and that if a country in the hemisphere is having problems, the first order of business is to help that country rebuild. It is not to say, hypothetically, would we take migrants from that country.
All right. Thank you so much for answering our questions tonight. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted them on Facebook, and to our live audience tonight. Let's give the candidate a round of applause.
Thank you, guys.
Wait, Mr. Young.
Oh, whoops.
We're not done yet.
He is excited to see the people.
You'll have a moment.
Before we close tonight, though, we would like to give you one final moment to give some final thoughts to those who are tuning in right now.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight, particularly those of you who are here in the studio. We are going through, again, the greatest economic transformation in the history of our country. And it is not immigrants that are causing these problems, it is technology. The question is, how are we going to start addressing the problems that got Donald Trump elected in 2016? And that is what I am laser focused on doing. Now, my candidacy, if you don't know anything about me, we are at 3% nationwide, and most people have never heard of me. We're raising millions of dollars in increments of only $20 each. So I joke all the time that my fans are cheaper than Bernie's. We are already drawing fans from the conservative part of the political spectrum, Trump voters, libertarians, independents, as well as liberals and progressives. So what I've been saying to the American people, it's not left, it's not right, it's forward, and that's where we have to go in 2020.
All right, and now this officially concludes our first Insider 2020 Town Hall. We will make sure you get a chance to meet all the people who are here today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Join our Facebook group to keep the conversation going, and we'll see you tomorrow for another episode of Business Insider Today.